50 years is not a number that belongs in a story about hope. 50 years is the length of a career, the span of a marriage, the entire arc of a child's life from birth to middle age. 50 years is long enough for the world to change completely around the thing you are waiting for, and long enough for the person waiting to wonder, on the quietest nights, whether the waiting itself has become the point. Ida Mae Brooks was 73 years old. She had outlasted a great deal in her life: poverty, loss, illness, the grinding, ordinary difficulty of decades, lived without much cushion between herself and hardship. She had outlasted all of it, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided, at some foundational level, that endurance was not a choice so much as a fact about her character. But there was one thing she had not outlasted, one thing that had stayed with her through every decade, every change of address, every hard year and occasional good one. She had given a son up for adoption in 1974, when she was 23 years old and had nothing. No money, no stable home, no support structure that could hold a child safely. She had made the choice that she believed was the right one for him. And she had spent the 50 years since wondering whether she had been correct, whether he was well, whether he had become the kind of person she had hoped he might be, and whether he had ever wondered about her. She had never stopped wondering. She had simply learned to carry the wondering without letting it consume everything else. On a Tuesday afternoon in Memphis, Tennessee, she walked onto the stage of Family Feud with her granddaughter and 3 other family members, expecting nothing more than a game show and a good afternoon. What Steve Harvey gave her instead was 50 years returned. Subscribe now and stay with this story to the end, because this one is about the kind of love that does not require a response to remain intact, and about what happens when the response finally comes. Ida Mae Brooks had been born in rural Mississippi in 1951, the 4th of 7 children in a sharecropping family that worked land they did not own and lived in conditions that the word difficult does not adequately describe. She had come to Memphis at 18, alone, with the specific determination of someone who has decided that the life they were born into is not the life they intend to keep. She found work in a garment factory, then in a hospital laundry, then in a school cafeteria, each position a small step forward. Each one survived with the same quiet resolve. She had become pregnant at 22 in circumstances she has described publicly, only in general terms. A relationship that was not going to hold, a man who was not going to stay, and a personal situation that left her with no realistic means of providing for a child with any stability or safety. She had carried the pregnancy to term. She had held her son for 2 hours in the hospital, long enough, she has said, to understand completely what she was giving up and to make the decision anyway, because she believed it was what was right for him rather than what was bearable for her. She had named him in her own mind, though she did not know what name the adoptive family would give him. She had called him James, after her father. She had told no one. In the years that followed, Ida Mae had rebuilt. She had eventually married, had 2 daughters, and had built a life in Memphis that was modest but stable and genuinely her own. Her husband had passed away 14 years earlier. Her daughters were grown with families of their own. Her granddaughter, Tanya, 28, was the family member who had organized the Family Feud appearance, entering them in an online contest as a birthday gift for Ida Mae, and being genuinely surprised when the call came through that they had been selected. Ida Mae had filed adoption search paperwork twice in her life, once in 1989, when she was S38, and once in 2003, when she was 52. Both times, the process had moved slowly, incompletely, and ultimately without resolution. The second search had produced a name and a city, Marcus, living in Nashville, but the intermediary service she had used had not been able to confirm a match with confidence, and Ida Mae had been unwilling to approach a man who might not be her son and who might not wish to be found. She had held the name and the city like a compass point she could not yet navigate toward. Marcus Allen was 50 years old. He had been adopted as an infant by a couple in Nashville, Tennessee, had grown up there, and had spent his adult life working as a high school football coach, a job he described as the best possible use of everything his adoptive parents had given him, because it was essentially the work of raising young men with intention and care. He had been married for 22 years to a woman named Beverly, and they had 3 children. He had known he was adopted from the age of 6. He had thought about his birth mother with a frequency and a tenderness that he had been, for most of his life, unable to fully articulate. He had registered with 3 adoption reunion registries, in his 40s and had worked with a private search consultant for 2 years without a definitive result. When his daughter, 22-year-old Simone, who had inherited his persistence and applied it to genealogical research, with a thoroughness that he found both impressive and occasionally alarming, had found Ida May through a combination of DNA testing and public records, Marcus had sat in his kitchen for a very long time before he was able to speak. Simone had contacted the Family Feud production team 6 weeks before the taping. Marcus had agreed immediately. Beverly had helped him choose what to wear. He had been on a plane to Memphis before he had fully processed what he had agreed to. Tanya, Ida May's granddaughter, had known for 5 weeks and had not said a word. She described the experience of sitting across from her grandmother at Sunday dinners during that period as the most demanding thing she had done in her adult life. The Brooks family, Ida May, Tanya, Ida May's daughter, Loretta, Loretta's husband, David, and a family friend named Miss Paulette, who had known Ida May for 35 years, came to the studio with the relaxed, generous energy of a group that had been together long enough to be comfortable with each other's edges. Miss Paulette, it emerged within the first 4 minutes, had an opinion about everything and was entirely at ease sharing it, which delighted the audience and gave Steve Harvey enough material to sustain the pre-game warmth well beyond its usual duration. Ida May played with a careful, smiling attentiveness that drew genuine affection from the audience, in the gradual, unforced way that certain people accumulate warmth, not by doing anything in particular, but simply by being entirely and visibly themselves. She was not performing enjoyment. She was having a good afternoon, and the distinction was legible to everyone in the room. Steve Harvey came to her naturally. During the first break, with the unhurried manner he used when the conversation he was about to have was one he had thought about in advance. He asked how old she was. She told him 73 with an expression that suggested the number was not something she had any particular quarrel with. He asked what the secret was. She said, minding your own business and getting enough sleep, in that order. The audience responded. Steve laughed in the real way, not the performance way. He said, "You got family here with you today?" She gestured to her team with an easy pride. She introduced Tanya as my granddaughter, the one responsible for all of this, with an affection in her voice that made the audience warm further. Steve said, "You got other grandchildren, kids?" Ida May said, "2 daughters, 4 grandchildren." She paused. The pause was small, barely half a second, but it had a texture to it that Steve Harvey registered without making anything of it in the moment. Then she said, in the same level tone she used for everything else, "And a son I gave up for adoption 50 years ago." She said it the way she had said it to perhaps a dozen people over the course of her life, cleanly, without drama, as a fact that was part of her history and that she had long since decided deserved to be stated honestly when it was relevant, rather than hidden. Steve Harvey became still. He said, 50 years. She said he would be 50 years old now. I have thought about him every day of those 50 years. I hope he has had a good life. I have to believe he has. Steve Harvey looked at her for a moment with an expression that the production team later described as the expression of a man confirming, internally, that what he was about to do was the right thing and that he was ready to do it. Then he nodded once, said quietly, "I hear you, Ida May," and moved back to the game. Tanya had not looked up from the floor for the entirety of that exchange. The Brooks family played the main game with enough combined skill and enthusiasm to win comfortably. Miss Paulette's contribution to the final round was so decisive and so unapologetically confident that Steve Harvey told her, with complete seriousness, that she had missed a calling. The celebration that followed was warm and genuine. Ida May laughed with the full, unguarded ease of a woman having exactly the kind of afternoon she had come for. Then Steve Harvey moved the team toward the fast money podium, and something shifted in the quality of the room. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have been legible to anyone watching casually, but in the specific way that a room shifts when the people who know what is coming are bracing for it. Ida May stepped to the podium. She smoothed her blouse. She looked at the game board with composed readiness. Steve Harvey walked to her. He stopped close. He looked at her with the expression that everyone in the studio who had been watching him carefully had been waiting to see. He said, "Ida May, you told me that you have a son out there somewhere, that you have thought about him every day for 50 years. She held his gaze. She said, "Every single day." Steve Harvey's voice, when he spoke, was so quiet that the microphones had to work to carry it. He said he has been thinking about you too, and he is here. Ida May Brooks did not move. She stood at the fast money podium with her hands flat on the surface in front of her. and looked at Steve Harvey as if the sentence he had just spoken was in a language she recognized, but had not expected to hear in this room, at this moment, in this lifetime. She said, "Say that again." Steve Harvey said it the same way, with the same quietness and the same completeness. "He is here, Ida May." She turned. Marcus Allen was standing at the side of the stage. He was 50 years old. He was 6 feet 2, with his mother's eyes, a detail that Beverly had noticed the first time she saw a photograph of Ida. Mayan had kept to herself until this moment, because some information deserves to arrive in person. He was not wearing anything symbolic or carrying anything that represented the distance between them. He simply stood there, looking at the woman who had held him for 2 hours in a hospital 50 years ago and had believed, in the faith-based way that people believe things they cannot verify, that he was somewhere in the world doing well. Ida May walked off the podium. She did not cross the stage quickly. She was 73 years old, and she walked with the deliberateness of a woman whose body carries its age honestly. And the deliberateness made the crossing more moving, not less. Each step a visible, effortful choice, the full weight of 50 years present in the distance between where she stood and where her son was waiting. Marcus met her LF way. He was considerably larger than she was, and when he folded down to embrace her, the size difference between them, this large man and this small, 73-year-old woman, carried something that the entire studio felt at once. He held her the way people hold something they were afraid they would never find. She held him the way people hold something they gave away, believing it was the right thing, and have spent 50 years hoping. They were correct. The studio was silent for a long time. Steve Harvey was crying. Not quietly, not with composed dignity. Crying in the open, unguarded way that happens when a person is caught entirely without their professional armor by something real. His hand was over his mouth. His eyes were full. He was making no effort whatsoever to manage his expression, and the cameras showed his face because his face was telling the truth about what was happening in that room, more honestly than any commentary could have. He could not speak. The producer moved toward him with a quiet question. He shook his head once, a small, clear gesture that meant not yet, and remained where he was, watching the two of them, giving the moment the full space it had earned. After a long while, Ida May pulled back just far enough to look at her son's face. She put both hands on either side of it, the way mothers hold faces, and she looked at him the way you look at something you have been picturing for 50 years and are now seeing with your own eyes for the first time since it was an infant. She said, "You grew up fine." Marcus's composure, which had held through the walk across the stage and the first minutes of the embrace, broke on those 3 words. He pressed his face against his mother's hair and held on. When Steve Harvey finally found his voice, it was several minutes after the reunion had begun. He spoke from where he was standing, without moving toward them, as if approaching would disturb something that needed to be left exactly as it was. He said, and his voice was not steady, "I have been on this stage for a long time." He stopped, started again. "I have tried in that time to do right by the people who stand here." He stopped again. "I do not always know if I manage it, but today." He shook his head. He could not finish the sentence, and he did not try. He looked at the audience. He said, "You all just witnessed something that I will carry for the rest of my life. I need you to understand that." Tanya, standing at the edge of the stage, was not attempting to compose herself. Simone, Marcus's daughter, the one who had found Ida May, who had been backstage throughout, walked out at some point during the reunion and stood beside her cousin, and the two young women held each other with the wordless solidarity of people who have both been carrying the same weight from different sides and have just, together, been allowed to set it down. The audience rose and did not sit down again for a very long time. The fast money round did not take place. The $20,000 was awarded in full, announced in 3 words by a production assistant, because Steve Harvey was in no condition to make announcements, and no one in the building found this surprising or insufficient. Marcus's daughter Simone later said that the prize was the last thing any of them were thinking about, and that this felt exactly right. Marcus and Ida May spent the remainder of that afternoon and the entirety of the following day together, initially with family present and gradually in the quieter, more private conversations that required fewer witnesses. Marcus brought photographs of his childhood, his wedding, his children, and spread them on a table in the green room while Ida May went through them, one by one with a slowness and attention that suggested she was committing each image to a form of memory that was different from ordinary recall. She asked about his adoptive parents. He told her about them, their kindness, their consistency, the way they had raised him to know he was chosen and loved. She listened with an expression that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but something that contained both. The expression of a woman learning that the decision she had lived with for 50 years had produced the outcome she had hoped for when she made it. She said, "I did not know if I was brave or a coward. I still do not know entirely, but I can see that he is good, and that is what I needed." Marcus said, "You were neither. You were a 23-year-old woman in an impossible situation, who made the best decision she could for someone she had just met and already loved. I have thought about that my whole life. I have never blamed you for it." The episode aired 7 weeks after the taping. The clip of Steve Harvey breaking down, unable to speak, hand over his mouth, making no attempt to compose himself, became the most watched moment in the show. Steve's digital history at the time of airing, surpassing the previous record within 48 hours. What drove the sharing was not simply the reunion, but Steve Harvey's unguarded face. A man who had made a career of having something to say, left with nothing. Commentators observed that his silence communicated more about the significance of the moment than any commentary he could have offered, and that the production team's decision to let the cameras show it rather than cutting away was itself an act of respect. The response from viewers was immediate and sustained. Adoption search organizations across the country reported significant increases in registrations and inquiries in the weeks following the broadcast. The Donaldson Adoption Institute cited the episode in a policy brief on the importance of accessible, funded reunion support services for adoptees and birth parents. Several legislators in states with restrictive original birth certificate access laws referenced the episode in committee discussions about reform. Steve Harvey wrote about the episode at length, in a reflection shared through his foundation. He wrote that the detail that remained with him most persistently was not the reunion itself, but Ida May's sentence in the pre-game conversation, "I have to believe he has had a good life." He wrote, "She had 50 years of not knowing, and she chose every day of those 50 years to believe the best. That is not passive hope, that is an act of will, sustained across half a century. I do not know if I have ever been in the presence of anything more quietly extraordinary than that." He also wrote with characteristic directness about his own breakdown on stage. He said, "I have been asked whether I was embarrassed. I was not. I was grateful. I was grateful that whatever professional habit usually keeps me composed had the good sense to get out of the way of something that deserved to be felt fully. If I had kept it together in that moment, I would have kept it together wrong." Marcus and Ida May established a rhythm of contact in the months following the taping that built deliberately and without forced pace. Monthly visits, alternating between Memphis and Nashville, regular calls, a Christmas that Marcus spent in Memphis with Beverly and their 3 children, the first time Ida May's family and Marcus's family occupied the same house, a fact that produced a particular quality of fullness in the rooms that everyone present noticed and that no one tried to quantify. Simone, Marcus's daughter, who had found Ida May through DNA testing and public records, who had set the entire chain of events in motion, was asked in an interview what had prompted her to start the search. She said, "My dad spent his whole life being grateful for what he had and curious about what he had come from. I watched him carry both of those things at the same time for 22 years. I thought if I can answer the second one, maybe he gets to carry just the first one. That seemed like a good thing to try to do for your father." Ida May, for her part, said in her one extended public interview that the experience had not resolved everything, that 50 years of wondering does not dissolve entirely because the wondering has been answered, and that grief and joy are not mutually exclusive, and can occupy the same space without one canceling the other. She said, "I am glad he came. I am glad he is well. I am glad I got to see his face while I am still here to see it." She paused. "I just wish it had not taken this long. But it took what it took, and it is enough." The sentence, "it took what it took, and it is enough," was shared widely and cited in contexts well beyond the episode itself. In grief counseling resources, in adoption support forums, in discussions about late-life reconciliation and a particular kind of closure that arrives not as resolution but as acceptance, layered with presence. Marcus returned to coaching that autumn. Several of his players had seen the episode. He did not address it directly, but his assistant coach, who had known him for 11 years, said that something in the quality of his attention to the young men on his team shifted after the reunion, that he watched them with a slightly different kind of care. The way a person looks at something when they understand more fully what they are looking at. Ida Mae attended one of his team's games in the spring. She sat in the stands with Beverly and watched her son coach from the sideline. She did not know the rules of football well enough to follow the technical details of what he was doing, but she watched him move, the way he carried himself, the way the young men responded to him, the authority and warmth that he exercised in the same register without apparent effort. And she understood everything she needed to understand. On the drive home, Beverly asked her what she was thinking. Ida Mae said, "I was thinking that he turned out exactly the way I hoped he would." She said it quietly and with a completeness that closed 50 years in a single sentence. Steve Harvey ended his written reflection on the episode with a passage that has since been quoted in discussions about television, about family, and about the long, uneven work of hope. He wrote, Ida Mae Brooks waited 50 years. She did not wait passively. She waited with intention, with a decision, renewed every morning, to believe that somewhere out there her son was living a good life. When I told her he was here, what I saw on her face was not surprise. It was confirmation. She had known, in the way that certain people know things, that this moment existed somewhere ahead of her. She had simply been walking toward it for 50 years. On a Tuesday afternoon in Memphis, she arrived. If this story reached you, please like this video and subscribe. These are the moments that remind us that love does not expire. We will see you in the next one.